Hello and welcome to the first of the Zero Emissions Byron's EV webinar series. In this first webinar of 8, we're getting revved up about electric vehicles. And to help start our rechargeable engines are the CEO of Electric Vehicle Council of Australia, Bygrave Jafari, and Dr. Stephen Bygrave, Director for Climate Resilience and Net Zero Energy for New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. They're joining us to discuss the challenges and benefits of transitioning to electric vehicles and what New South Wales is doing to assist the path to zero emissions transport. I'm Mick O'Regan, and it's my pleasure to be your facilitator as we tackle our first topic, the electrical vehicle revolution, or EVREV if you can't go past an acronym. Zero Emissions Byron warmly thanks its sponsors, including our principal sponsor, Bank Australia, major sponsor, NRMA, community sponsors, ClubCar, Enova Community Energy, and Light Touch Solar and Electrical for making this webinar series possible. And right at the start, I want to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners, the custodians of the land that I'm on right now, the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that wherever you're joining us, if you're in Australia, you're on Aboriginal land. Before we get cracking, just a quick word on the questions, as I'm sure there'll be lots. If you'd like to put a question to either Byhyad or Stephen, remember to use the Q&A button, not the chat button on your screen. My colleague, Bridie Schmidt, will be collating the questions, which I'll then put to our panellists. As always, short, direct questions are best. So let's meet our panellists. Byhyad Jafari, as the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council, works with industry, government and the media to accelerate the electrification of road transport for a more sustainable and prosperous Australia. With years of experience providing focused advice, he has a strong understanding of Australia's political, corporate and media landscape. Welcome, Byhyad. And also Dr. Stephen Bygrave, who's currently Director of Climate Resilience and Net Zero Emissions for the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. In a storied career working at the highest levels of government, Stephen's knowledge of climate change policy, strategy and regulation is extremely impressive. He's worked in a variety of roles, including Assistant Secretary and General Manager in the Department of Climate Change and in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Clean Energy Regulator. So I feel that we'll be driving with confidence with these two at the wheel for our discussions. To get things moving, I'd like to again welcome Byhyad and ask him to begin by giving us a sense of where the EV revolution is at the moment. Byhyad.
Thanks so much for that, Mick, and thanks for everyone for joining us for what I'm sure will be a great conversation tonight. I'm going to start sharing my work here and trust that this will all operate smoothly for me. Here we go. Up to the top of my screen. So given that we have our Stephen here, I didn't want to spend as much time speaking about New South Wales and more specifically because I appreciate he'll be covering much more of that. What I thought I could do for a few brief moments at the beginning is to talk a bit about what's happening with the world of electric vehicles, where different markets are up to, what some of our challenges are in Australia and what we can do about it. I'll be trying to race through that reasonably quickly because my favourite part of webinars is speaking with all of you and answering questions. So here we go. So first of all, the Electric Vehicle Council, we're a rather non-traditional peak body representing the electric vehicle sector in Australia. Say non-traditional because we represent sectors that's a whole range of different traditional sectors. So everyone from what's in the name, electricity companies, vehicle companies, but also technology and software groups, infrastructure providers, professional services firms, really trying to bring the whole ecosystem together to help develop and support the electric vehicle sector. So what I wanted to start our conversation with was discussing the type of change that we are talking about when it comes to shifting towards electric vehicles. We're all quite familiar with different products and how different sort of companies and brands work. And that's usually more of a cycle of slowly, gradually a new brand, a new, whether it's Coke or Pepsi or what have you, coming onto the market, taking on a portion of the market share, being superseded by someone else and moving on. But importantly, when it comes to electric vehicles, while they look a lot like cars and buses and trucks, much like the vehicles that we already have, we're actually talking about a technological transformation. And what we have here is a historical look at a range of different successful new technologies when they've entered into the market and how their adoption works. And as you'll see here, over the past 100 or so years, this trend has become more and more rapid as more new technologies have entered into the marketplace. But what we see is this, is that for the first few years that the technology comes on board, there's some level of incremental growth, getting towards about 5–10% of the market share. During that time, a few things are happening. Consumers are getting familiar with the technology, they're getting comfortable with it, any associated infrastructures being built, so think things like mobile phones and mobile phone towers or telecommunications towers, and the prices of that new technology are falling. At some stage, you hit a tipping point, and then you get that very sharp rise that you see on the right-hand side of them. It's where you start seeing technologies go from 5 or 10% of market share towards very close to 100% within 1 or 2 years. So again, recognizing when we're talking about how the world is shifting to electric vehicles, we're looking at how are they going on this assessment. Will electric vehicles end up on this chart or not? Because you recognize only the successful technologies end up on here, so Betamax isn't on here, for instance. So what are the factors that we need to look at? Where are different countries and where are different markets up to? The first thing that we see that gives a lot of countries confidence that this is a shift that is now well and truly going to occur and is well and truly underway, it's no longer speculative around the world, is the thing that replaces the engine within an electric vehicle. That's the cost of the battery pack. What we have here is a look at battery pack prices per kilowatt hour from 2010 through to today and projected moving forward. And there's the thing that's really, set the broader clean energy world as well as the electric vehicle world on fire. It's that those costs have fallen dramatically already. They've fallen by about 83% over the last 10 years. And then even based on very conservative estimates, and so I should say this is all based on US currencies, and it's an average of a number of different sources, because of course there's no one cost for a battery pack. Different companies charge different amounts, but we can sort of say on average, this is how much people are paying today. So it's fallen from about $1,000 US per kilowatt hour back in 2010 to around $170 odd US per kilowatt hour this year. And then if we assume that it starts falling at a much more gradual rate, and we say much more gradual rate because we like to be conservative, or people who do these projections like to be conservative because they don't want to be wrong in the wrong direction. We say that they continue to fall by around 20 or 25% every year that follows. That's when we start to see what these two black lines here represent, which is that on average at around 2021, we'll start to see the average price of, within certain segments, electric vehicles being cheaper to own than internal combustion engine vehicles. And then the really exciting part, particularly for the broader market, which is by around 2024, 2025, we'll start seeing segments of electric vehicles being cheaper to buy up front. So the sticker price that you'll see at a dealership being cheaper than a petrol or diesel equivalent. And that's really the one that we focus on quite a lot, because what we know from how particularly private consumers buy vehicles is that they either look at the sticker price or they put a certain price inside of their web browser and they only see vehicles that are in that price range. So what we've had around the world is a number of countries say, okay, so we can see where we're headed. Sometime throughout this decade, we are going to get closer and closer towards a tipping point. And we want that to occur for a number of reasons. We want the environmental, the social, the economic benefits out of a shift to electric vehicles. So we want to start preparing ourselves today. We often talk about in Australia, we're behind the rest of the developed world when it comes to the shift to electric vehicles. We want to take a closer look at exactly what that means. Because it's very easy to look at the countries like Norway that are head and shoulders above everyone else, and more than half of the new cars that they sell in that market are electric. But on average for the rest of the world, what we have is somewhere around 2 to 4% or 2 to 5% of the new cars they sold last year were electric. That number's at a bit above 5% throughout the first half of this year. That's on average what we're talking about, 3.5–4% market share for electric vehicles or for plug-in vehicles. In Australia, as we said, we're still at around less than 1%, 0.6% last year, looking like we're at 0.7% for this year. So it's one thing, I think, when we start thinking about this challenge of shifting over to electric vehicles, of thinking about every single vehicle on our roads and how we make all of them in all of their different use cases electric. But it's a much more tangible outcome to say, how can we stop being this country at the right-hand side here and be somewhere around the middle of the pack at the very least, and then ideally moving closer and closer towards the front of the pack in future years. To put that into perspective, for 2019, that would have meant selling about 40,000 electric vehicles or plug-in vehicles in our market. What we did sell was around 6,700 electric vehicles. So again, it's a much more surmountable task if we think about how can we start selling tens of thousands more vehicles? How can in the next year we sell 60,000 as opposed to, for instance, another 6,000 again vehicles? I'm just seeing a little notification, but I can't say what it is, so I hope I'm doing everything right. Carrying on, what it's meant for the Australian market, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about what other countries are doing to be at that higher level that we're not doing. But what it's meant for our market is that the number of electric vehicle models that we get that are made available for Australian consumers are limited, and they're particularly limited at the lower end of the market. So cars priced under $60,000, and I apologise, I'm going to keep using cars as a reference point for broader vehicles here, just because we have a lot more data about it and we can analyse it, and it serves as a useful proxy for everything else. But cars priced under $60,000 is where we've been most traditionally restricted. That's for a very clear reason. For a car company to deliver a vehicle priced between $40,000 to $60,000, they need several thousand sales in order to make their returns, because the margin on a lower priced vehicle is far lower. Whereas bringing a more expensive vehicle, you can see there, the yellow in this bar chart is cars priced above 60,000, and the overwhelming majority of those are priced above 100,000. There, you need several hundred in order to make your returns. So it's much easier for a car company to deliver a luxury brand electric vehicle to our market than it is to deliver one that's in the mass market segments. And so we have a bit of a circular issue there, where Australian consumers, and particularly the mass consumers, not people who are studying this carefully, think of electric vehicles as expensive luxury vehicles, in some cases preventing policy changes to occur, whereas really the lack of those policy changes is what's causing our market to look in this distorted way. Because when we look around the rest of the world, and particularly here we've got the United Kingdom, when we look around the rest of the world, their availability of cheaper electric vehicles is far higher. In the United Kingdom, when we focus on them a lot because they're a major right-hand drive market, they have sort of culturally similar consumers to ours, so a lot of car companies will look at the UK and in their product planning and think about what type of right-hand drive vehicles to build and then bring them to ours. They have roughly, there's actually a few more since I've made this graph, roughly about 30 electric vehicle models available in what turns into less than $60,000 Australian. In Australia, we have about 7 of these vehicles made available to our market. A little bit there about emissions. I might just skip over some of this so I can be a bit faster here. But looking at what the two differences are, the two key things that we're looking at are what we have around the rest of the world are very stringent vehicle emissions regulations. And then on the other end, so that sort of being the stick for the light vehicle segment. And then on the other end, generous incentives to encourage consumers to buy an electric vehicle over a petrol or diesel one. So if you go into a dealership, you're looking at 2 cars side by side, one of them electric, you know that you get what looks like on average around the world around $10,000 Australian back in your pocket, making that vehicle cheaper to buy. Again, nothing similar being made available in Australia. Then just to focus down a bit further on that, these are all national incentives, as you can see, range at usually around $10,000 Australian. But then looking at subnational levels, we have a whole range of additional efforts being made by state governments, and I'll be pitching over for more on state governments shortly as well, turning those into closer to $15,000, $20,000 incentives once coupled on top of the national incentive available there. And then finally, sending a very strong signal to markets to say, bring your vehicles here, and importantly, start investing in things like charging infrastructure and other e-mobility services in our markets by setting long-term targets as well as interim goals in order to get there. So today we see something like 61% of today's new vehicle sales market has said that by 2040, we'll no longer be buying internal combustion engine vehicles. And increasingly, countries like the UK and others bringing those targets forward each year, recognizing in order to reach net zero emissions and to keep temperature rises below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, that really means that given the life cycle of a vehicle, so a car staying on our road for about 17, 20 years, meaning that you cannot continue to sell petrol and diesel vehicles in these markets for 2035 without carrying on some type of an offset cost. Yeah, I've gone on for about as long as I should there, so I've got a bit more, but I might stop there and hand back to the moderator. Thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Behyad. That was a great way to start, and it's given us plenty to think about it, particularly in terms of the kind of price sensitivity that we face here in Australia. But look, without further ado, I'm going to go quickly to Stephen Bygrave now. Stephen, we're looking forward to what you've got to say.
Thanks, Mick, and thanks, Behyad, and thanks, Zero Emissions Byron, for putting on this event. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered, elders past, present and emerging, and I'm on Ngunnawal land today. I have some slides, but we've had some issues, so those slides will be sent round to participants after the event. But I will talk and please ask questions along the way in the chat box. So I'll be talking about the New South Wales Government's Net Zero plan and the transport initiatives, particularly the electric vehicles initiatives underneath that plan. I'll also be talking about how the government is supporting the transition to electric vehicles. So the Net Zero Plan is announced by Minister Matt Keane in March, and it's probably the largest, most comprehensive net zero plan in Australia. It is backed by the federal government and the New South Wales government to the tune of $2 billion, $1 billion roughly coming from the federal government, $1 billion coming from the state government. And it covers four key priorities, the net zero plan. The first of those priorities is to drive the uptake of proven emission reduction technologies. The second priority is to empower consumers and businesses to make more sustainable choices. The third priority is to invest in the next wave of emissions reduction innovation. That's important because the net zero plan is called a net zero stage 1 plan from 2020 to 2030. And it also sets an interim emissions goal of 35% reduction in emissions by 2030. So we want to get to that target, 35% reduction by 2030, but we also want to invest in the next wave of technologies which will be ready post 2030. So there's a range of programs underneath the plan to support that next wave of innovation. The fourth priority is to ensure that the New South Wales government leads by example. And this is a classic case here in the EV sector where we're increasing the number of purchases of electric vehicles in the New South Wales government fleet. Obviously, there are a whole range of reasons why we'd go electric. Minister Matt Keane has been interviewed by Renew Economy. He said he actually drives a Tesla Model 3. He comments it's great value for money. It's the best car he's ever driven, and the running costs are virtually zero. So electric vehicles, as Behyad's been mentioning, they're fun, they're silent, they're powerful. That you get public health improvements by reducing exhaust. They're significantly cheaper to run. They improve our energy security. They reduce our carbon emissions. It's a safer driving experience, and they're convenient. You can charge anywhere. The net zero plan covers a whole range of sectors, not just EVs and transport. There's energy, there's waste, there's agriculture, there's future emissions from mining. There's a whole bunch of initiatives around carbon finance. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also an electricity strategy which will support investment in new generation, demand response, energy efficiency, and to increase the state's energy resilience. And combine the net zero plan and the electricity strategy will support almost 2,400 new jobs, $11.6 billion of new investment in New South Wales, and that will be mostly in regional areas. I mentioned the 35% interim emissions target, and that's important because you don't want to get to 2045 and go, how do we get to net zero emissions in 5 years? You want to set goalposts along the way, and so the 35% emission reduction goal by 2030 is one of those goalposts. I'm just going to touch on that first priority again underneath the Net Zero Plan, which refers to driving the uptake of proven emission reduction technologies. Underneath that priority, there's a whole range of programs on energy efficiency, green investment, organic waste to landfill, coal innovation. We've got a Prime Minister's Productivity Abatement program. But importantly, we have two key electric vehicle programs. One is our electric vehicle infrastructure and model availability program. And our second is making public spaces and buildings electric vehicle ready. The third priority underneath the plan has a number of relevant programs, and that's investing in the next wave of emission reduction innovation. There's a clean tech fund, and there's also a hydrogen fund, and these are very closely linked to electric vehicles in the sense that the vehicle to grid, there's been a few questions on the chat box already about vehicle to grid and demand response. There is one model being trialled in the ACT, the Nissan, that is trialling vehicle to grid. So it is happening. There's more models available overseas that we're hopefully getting into New South Wales that will perform that function. But hydrogen is also a competitor with electric vehicles, and the government is investing as part of its net zero plan into the hydrogen sector as well. I mentioned priority 4 in the plan around ensuring the New South Wales government leads by example. Not only are we increasing the proportion of electric vehicles in purchases in the New South Wales government fleet, but the government's also announced that it will be transitioning its 8,000 odd buses to electric buses as well. So that's quite an exciting initiative. We're increasing our target for electric and hybrid passenger vehicles to 30% by 2023, with at least 10% of those purchases, new purchases, being fully electric. I heard a dinger. Was that someone dinging me to tell me I should be stopping, or do I keep going, Mick?
Keep going.
Great. So the reason why we've got these transport initiatives is transport is an increasing and significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. In 2018, it accounted for about 22% of New South Wales's total emissions. Road transport was about 87% of that, and cars were almost 50%. So it is a huge proportion of our emissions, and it's a growing proportion of our emissions in New South Wales. There are a range of barriers, as Bygrave has mentioned, cost, charging, range anxiety, choice of models, and information. So we do want to increase the model availability in New South Wales, and to also increase the base charging infrastructure. So to do that, we've got 5 key elements. We want to incentivize electric vehicles in fleets, not just government fleets, but fleets across New South Wales. And this is important because this will increase the number of EV models coming into New South Wales and Australia. But also, as we all know, electric vehicles or vehicles that are in fleets end up in the second-hand market. So what will happen is there'll be more incentives for fleets to bring in EVs. That'll mean more EVs coming into New South Wales, but then more EVs when the fleet's lease periods run out, more EVs available in the second-hand market for the general public. The second key initiative is increasing in the charging infrastructure for EVs, with probably an up to 50% co-investment in public fast charging and ultra-fast charging stations. We have also, the third key strand is a transport consumer information package, where we want to provide more information to consumers around low emissions vehicles and electric vehicles. I mentioned the fleet target, the 4th key element in our New South Wales government fleet. And I also mentioned the 5th element, which is making our buildings and public spaces EV ready. For most of us living in big cities, many people live in apartments, and there are many barriers in charging a vehicle from an apartment, particularly if it doesn't have a garage, particularly if it doesn't have an EV charging point in a garage. So we want to make that much less prohibitive in the New South Wales market. So we are looking at a fleet program. We'll be providing incentive payments for passenger and light commercial vehicles in fleets. And we also will provide an education advisory service. In the charging space, we want to increase the number of chargers both in regional areas, on our highways, in our metro areas, and we'll deal with a number of barriers there in terms of the cost of public charging, some of the barriers around network tariffs, and some of the barriers around range anxiety. We'll develop a New South Wales charging master plan to do that, and we'll be co-investing in those public fast and ultra-fast charging stations. I might leave it there, but just to touch on the Making Buildings EV Ready, we will be updating our New South Wales Apartment Design Guide and the CEP 65, and we'll also be working with other governments around Australia to complement the changes to the National Construction Code in 2022 to ensure that we can make our buildings and public spaces more EV ready. Mick, I'll pass back to you in the interest of time, and we can keep the conversation going.
Lovely, Stephen. Thank you very much. So we've got really a lot to chew on here from both our expert panelists. Look, I'm going to go to the first question that's come in. It's from Damien and it's directed to you, Byard. And he says, your 2024 price equivalence chart early on, does this mean the cost of batteries equals the cost of internal combustion engines, or that EVs will reach price parity with ICE vehicles, and where in Australia and where else?
Yeah, good question. So it's the latter. It means that today the premium or the additional cost that you're paying for an electric vehicle is because of the battery. That's the new technology part that costs more. And with that falling, then the cost of, I should say, it's the cost of producing the electric vehicle becomes cheaper to make one than to make an internal combustion engine vehicle. And I should say that's within certain segments. So that doesn't mean that every single car gets cheaper. It means that on average, in some segments, you'll start to see electric vehicles being cheaper than the average price of the vehicle sold for a petrol vehicle sold within that segment. The second part of that is a really fascinating point though, right? In Australia or elsewhere, because what we've already seen is that there are already cheaper electric vehicles. Not very many of them come here. So the question there is really up to us of, do we put supportive policies in place, like the type that Stephen's talking about, to help make sure that we get those models here? And as electric vehicles become both more powerful and cheaper, and by more powerful I mean able to have more electric utes and have different sort of varieties available. The key question for us isn't where is electric vehicle technology going, it's who will invest to bring them into our market in the first place. And really that's where companies are looking for that certainty of demand, to say, we know very well where countries in the EU or the US or across Asia are going. They give us regulations, they give us incentives, they give us targets to reach that tell us bring electric vehicles here. We are preparing our market, we're building out the infrastructure, we're doing the things necessary to get ourselves ready for that. We don't see something similar happening in Australia. So the question is, do we start selling them elsewhere and then wait for Australia to catch up? And the short answer to that is that's already what's happening. So I guess there's not too much speculation needed there. The keys are, how do we keep working with governments like New South Wales and others, in particular, I guess, federally, at adopting the same changes that the rest of the developed world has adopted in order to make sure that doesn't continue to happen.
Great, thank you, Byard. Stephen, I'll go to you with a question from Vicky, a very practical question. Will there be dedicated lanes for EVs, autonomous vehicles and public transport in the New South Wales road network?
The government hasn't considered that at this point in time. The main initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, Mick and Vicky, were those increasing the charging infrastructure across all metro, regional and highway areas in New South Wales, making buildings EV ready and dealing with this major barrier to design rules and to the National Construction Code. And then most importantly, that fleet initiative in fleets across New South Wales, private fleets, to really bring more EVs into the market. And then obviously in getting more EVs into the New South Wales government fleet itself. Thanks.
Right. Just to follow up on that, because we have a question from Muriel a bit further down, but so what exactly is the incentive for fleet uptake?
Yeah, look, we're working through that. We're considering a reverse auction mechanism. we're still in the very early stages of program design, but obviously a reverse auction has been used in a whole range of areas, including for renewables. And we think this is a suitable mechanism that could be applied to get more EVs into fleets. But it's very early in our thinking at this point.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Bayard, fast charging stations are obviously a key requirement for continued uptake of EVs, especially for rural and regional communities. Are there some key things that councils and their local communities can do or put in place that would encourage installation of charging stations by the public or private sector?
Yeah, there are some things that councils are doing, and I'd say councils right across the country have a very strong appetite for the measures that they can take to support electric vehicles. Some really good examples in New South Wales as well, but I'm going to pick on one from Victoria recently, where a group of local councils came together to develop a sort of regional guide. So acknowledging that local councils are a bit more fragmented than states, there's a lot more of them, looking at how can we attract investment in electric vehicle charging by, I guess, showing, doing what you would usually do in tourism, by letting people know what we have available, showing that we have an appetite to support that type of investment. So there is land available, we'll make it easy for you to be able to build these things here. But what's really fascinating in the case of New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, what most of these business cases have been built on for them is how to enable tourism investment to occur. So acknowledging that people driving electric vehicles today are people who can afford, by and large, new vehicles, because most of electric vehicles on our roads are being bought firsthand at the moment. And those are people who, when they come, can also spend money on a lot of other things. And if your town has an electric vehicle charger, that person will stop there for a period of time to recharge, and as opposed to a neighbouring community. So a bit of healthy competition there in sort of getting these things set up and bringing people, letting people both enjoy those longer trips, as well as making sure they, rather than sort of stopping on the side of a highway, they go into a town and spend some time there and spend some money in that community as well. I'd say a few things for them there of I guess, let people know that you're interested, band together with other people, and I guess then similarly for your own, not just for the people passing through town, but also thinking about your own citizens as well, thinking about providing charging infrastructure inside of regularly frequented spots, whether that's in your city, in your CBD or workplaces or otherwise.
Okay, and just to follow on that tourist focus that you added there, Bayard, what about light electric vehicles like electric mopeds for sharing? Is that an element that you see greater potential?
Yeah, absolutely. I did say at the beginning, apologies, I keep referring to cars, but really in my mind, that's a proxy for everything else. So everything from buses, trucks, electric bikes, mopeds, motorcycles, and the rest as well. Really, and if you sort of look at our work as an organisation more broadly, you'll often see us talk about cars. That's just because there's so many millions of them around that we can sort of analyse that market and use it as a proxy. What I'd say is outside of electric bicycles, for electric mopeds and motorcycles, again, it's an area where, much like the rest of the road system or the infrastructure system, they sort of rely on cars to get the stuff done for them, right? So if you're trying to get a new road built, you're saying, well, there are going to be a few million cars that'll drive on that road and that'll let me run my moped business. Similar things occur in whether it's the business case for charging infrastructure or otherwise. The more we can get cars moving in that direction, the more investment will flow. And then on top of that, you're able to get e-mobility service providers, whether that's car share or moped share or otherwise, and certainly makes sense inside of whether it's regional towns or big cities in helping people do that sort of last mile transport solutions.
Great, thank you. Stephen, I should say, if any of these questions that you feel like you'd like to add a line or two to the previous answer, just feel free. But I would like to come to you with a question from Rory. Will the restrictions on vehicle acceleration for government vehicles be waived so that Model 3 can be more widely adopted in government?
Yeah, Rory, we're aware of that issue, and all I can say is we're looking at it, and we're working with our Department of Transport colleagues, so we are aware of that issue. Thanks for raising it. Okay,
so look, we've canvassed a number of things about different types of vehicles, but I'm going to take Bayard's point that in referring to cars, he's referring to the general vehicle population. So I'd like to come back to a question from Vicky now, and possibly to you, Stephen. Is the New South Wales government planning for dedicated EV transport and autonomous vehicle only lanes on new and some existing roads? Is that part of the planning scenario?
Yeah, I think you already asked me that question, Mick. So, and I think I tried to answer it, but maybe
Okay.
yes.
It was quite similar to a previous question.
Yeah.
Right.
And
So another questions I've got coming in. Do EVs represent a risk to emergency service personnel after, for example, motorcycle accidents?
I can't comment on that, but Byard, you might be able to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. We've done a reasonable amount of work with particularly Fire and Rescue New South Wales, the way that emergency services work. They have a national sort of information sharing body. So whether it's EVs or any other issue, one body will sort of take the work forward and share it with everyone else. And Fire and Rescue New South Wales took the lead on this. Their take is very similar to the ones to emergency service responders right around the world, which is globally, the various comments have been made from, we consider electric vehicles to be safer, or at the very least as safe as internal combustion engines. A few reasons there. Both the vehicles themselves are built with the latest technology, so they're safer vehicles for you as a driver to own and drive. The sort of, I guess, that critical part of it you can appreciate in a battery electric vehicle. There's several inches of a type of a metal, depending on whose car you're talking about, surrounding the battery, making it safer. Whereas with a petrol vehicle, you get a lot more fires because there's a sort of a smaller fuel tank or a thinner fuel tank able to be punctured more easily, more frequently. The biggest conversation piece for them is just to recognize that the response needs to be different. So the way that you put out the fire, the way that you, if it's a fire, for instance, the way that you make the vehicle safe for transport and storage, they just need to know what are the changes that are required, what do we need to learn and be trained. And that's the work that we've sort of gone through with them. And similarly, it has happened already internationally, and we're the beneficiaries of some really good global training that we're able to pass on to emergency services here. You may have seen in New South Wales, as in other states, they've adopted a blue sticker, for instance, to give a bit of further visibility so that the first responder doesn't have to get too close before recognising that it's an electric vehicle, so that they know how to act appropriately on approach.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
The only thing I'd add to that is I did see a clip of a Tesla driving in floods in China this week. I don't know whether other people on the call saw that. So it just showed that the Tesla could actually get through some pretty hairy situations in water. I saw something from Elon Musk commenting that that was indeed the case. But Byard, do you know much about that?
I can say I know it is capable, and that some of that is sort of design features of sealing the vehicle. It's not advisable to do it because, of course, you can't see what's in floodwater, and you shouldn't drive through anything that you can't see. So not a recommendation, but yeah, I think the comment was that it is capable of floating for a certain amount of time, and wouldn't recommend people testing out to see how long that is.
Yeah, exactly. We do not, for everyone on the call, we do not encourage it, but it was interesting to see that clip in China.
I think everyone on the call will stick to the standard notion that if it's flooded, you get it. Stephen, a question from Greer. Countries leading EV adoption have strong emission standard laws. Does the New South Wales government support the adoption of emission standards in Australia to help drive an increasing range of low and zero emission vehicles into the market?
Yeah, I saw that question. Thanks, Greer. The emission standards issue is a federal government issue. So that's something that is up to the Australian government to pursue. We are obviously, New South Wales government and others are in touch with the Australian government in regular circumstances, and this issue has come up before. So, but it is a matter for the federal government.
So just on that, and you may have just answered this in a way, but to reiterate, what would happen to the Australian auto market if the government doesn't regulate vehicle emissions?
Well, I think in terms of electric vehicles, there's a whole range of other strategies which we're pursuing to increase the uptake of electric vehicles. And so, even without addressing specifically emission standards in Australia, we still think, and we've modelled this, and we've talked to Bygrave and other companies, that the range of incentives that the New South Wales government is offering will lead to a rapid uptake of EVs in New South Wales, even without adopting stronger emission standards. But obviously,
Right.
adopting stronger emission standards will assist, just like you need a broad range of initiatives to incentivise EVs.
Okay, Byron, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, why don't I can perhaps illustrate at a high level for, if you imagine, a car company deciding where to bring different products. And I always like to use the word investment, because of course for them it's not a car, it's an investment. It just happens to look like a car to you as the consumer. And so they're looking at a range of factors, right? They're looking at market readiness. That's things like how interested are consumers in new technologies, how much do they care about the environment, do they like electric vehicles, do they know what they are, infrastructure readiness, so how much public infrastructure is available, questions like, do you have a stable electricity grid, for instance, if you're trying to bring vehicles to parts of the world where that's much more of an important factor, and then that really critical one of policy. And like we say, it's that policy sort of ends up accounting for about 50% of the decision that they make when it comes to electric vehicles. And what we're able to see is when we talk about things like emission standards, 80% of the new vehicle sales market has one in place. So us not having one in place right away it looks a bit strange, right? It's a bit of an outlier. In fact, the United States implemented theirs back in 1976, and in 2020, Australia doesn't have one yet. So it sort of looks like, in some cases, almost not having roads and saying, bring electric cars here. But then there are other solutions, right? So there's that's sort of the stick side. What's the carrot side? Again, like we're saying, a lot of countries around the world have these $10,000 incentives to purchase an electric vehicle. So it's well, what else can you do on the other side to help attract it and bring them here? The good news for Australia is on all of that other stuff, they love our customers. Right? They say, you guys are really technology adaptive. You love new technologies. People get it, people want it, they do care about the environment, they do want all the benefits of electric vehicles. So we know there's something ready for us there. I guess we're just trying to fill a few more of those holes of where your policies are up to. Stephen pointed out with things like emission standards, it is a federal government responsibility. I think the good news is we've got states, including New South Wales, but states right around the country trying to step up, saying, we don't want to be in this position where we keep missing out and falling behind the rest of the world. We want to see what we can do to help fill those gaps and encourage the products to come here. And what's good for them is on the other end, they've got these companies saying, well, good, because we want to be in that position with you. We want you at the table so we can bring the products here.
Right. I want to go back to an earlier question, which I'm just reading now, and I think is interesting. It's from Peter. And Peter asks, why can't we build and connect more commuter bikeways for e-bikes and other bikes, which of course are set to explode with COVID social distancing regulations and will be here for a long time. And he points out that, for instance, in Sydney, there are no cardinal bike links connecting city centre to the far outer suburbs. And he wonders where the hierarchy is in transport planning. EVs are good, but shorter single passenger transport is best served with appropriate transport like e-bikes. Stephen, could I throw that to you first?
Yeah, I'll kick off, and then I'm sure Byard has a lot to say here too. I mean, ideally, in dealing with transport emissions, you've got a whole range of measures. You've got electrifying transport, you've got supporting active travel, you've got e-bikes, you've got more cycling, walking, and you're actually getting people out of cars and into public transport. So that's the full suite of measures you want to deal with in the transport sector. There's lots more we could be doing, particularly in Sydney, and in terms of the hierarchy of transport planning, we also have a City of Sydney and other councils that the New South Wales government needs to work with on dealing with emissions from the transport sector. And I talk to the City of Sydney quite regularly, and they talk to the New South Wales government quite regularly. So we're aware of many of these issues and barriers. And you'll note that there's more cycling coming into the City of Sydney, more dedicated cycleways. There's more to be done though. I think in terms of that there could be appropriate, as per Peter's comment, more e-bikes and more e-bike charging stations. There's a lot of workplaces now in Sydney and other big cities which have really good dedicated end of trip facilities. in their buildings, which is encouraging, in making it easier for people to cycle, including using e-bikes to get to work, to shower, to change in their clothes. I've just moved, before COVID, the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment has moved out to Parramatta, 4 Parramatta Square, and that building, for example, has excellent end-of-trip facilities. So there's a whole range of measures. I think I've just touched on a number of them, but electrification of vehicles is just one of many ways that we need to be implementing to reduce our emissions from the transport sector.
Thanks, Stephen.
Over to you, Byron.
Yeah, just have to say, I obviously can't answer the why can't we do it. I just think we should do it. Electric bicycles, the electric vehicle that I use most often, and I think some really good sort of tangible outcomes, things like when I talk to people providing sort of electric bicycle services as service operators, their sort of wish list of things like being able to have a charging bay with a electric vehicle sort of docking station, if you will, close to train stations, so that we're able to provide true last mile solutions. So one can get off a train, know that there's a fully charged electric bike there to make the rest of their journey. But I think really, some of those things are slowly occurring in various places. I think one of the silver linings that we're seeing, particularly here in Sydney, is an increasing number of what I hope are strategically or tactically being called temporary bike lanes, where certain car lanes or vehicle lanes are being shut down and turned into bike lanes, acknowledging that at the moment, there's a bit more sort of use of those being made. And what I would hope to see is that, that temporary occurs. People see that it's not the end of the world when you shut a lane down to cars to make them available for bikes, and then it stays that way in the long term as well. It can sort of sometimes be a useful or a sneaky way of getting some of these things done, where people are worried about a big change occurring, but then when it does occur, of course, we adapt and everything's fine, and if not better. It's much nicer having a bunch of bikes riding past your house than having a bunch of cars parked in front or cars rolling across it as well. So again, similarly, I think there's some things there in things like energy and transport policy, but it's really a broader question of when it comes to designing our built environment. If we're talking, as we are in a lot of cases now, about how do we make bikes fit inside of our road system, in some senses we sort of lost the part of the battle already. Of it should be a design consideration from the very beginning in how do we make our streetscape more comfortable for people to dine, to entertain one another, to walk, to ride bicycles, and if needed, use a car and drive across, to different, to access services as well.
Thank you, Brad. Just on that, and as a broader question, I do want to acknowledge that there is a question: can we have e-rickshaws like in India? And I'm just going to go on the basis that from what you've just said, Brad, yes, they sound like a good idea, though I don't want to be in the front. I just, because we are running, close to time, we've only got under 10 minutes left. This issue of mindset, that Australia, it seems to me, in lots of other technologies, has been identified as a community of early adopters. What do you think the impediments are? What makes you a bit pessimistic about our capacity to change our mindset and be more open to electric vehicles?
I'm certainly not pessimistic about our ability to do it. I think there's a few structural things that isn't sort of, I don't blame the consumer for this, right? Where it's how do we set things like these regulations and these policies up to give investors the certainty to bring products here, to build infrastructure here, because I think the consumer is sort of ready and eager. We do an annual survey that we do on purpose with the motoring clubs, so NRMA, RACV, RACQ and others, and we do it in partnership with them because obviously a survey by the Electric Vehicle Council that says electric vehicles are great sort of sounds a little bit chonky, so we do it independently with them, and every year we find that well over half of the respondents say that they would like their next vehicle to be an electric one, and that they would like to see more support provided in this area. They'd like to see our system transitioning over. So I think as soon as we can get a few of these things that we're trying to get knocked over, a few of these barriers knocked over, I think we've got a sort of ready and waiting customer base, or a sort of base of motorists ready to shift over.
And Mick, I'm happy to jump in there too. I mean, the way I see it is the electric vehicle market is where solar photovoltaic was 20 years ago. And, in the federal government, I was involved with designing the mandatory renewable energy target and some of the early programs in the federal government to support rooftop solar. And, back then, 30 years ago, rooftop solar was considered space age technology, you know, the thing you put on space stations. And now look at Australia, you know, over 2 million households with rooftop solar and growing rapidly. And we've seen that even in the last year with electric bikes. You know, there's a few questions about electric bikes. You know, they were pretty rare, 2, 3, not rare, but, you know, you didn't see many of them. Now you go to any bike shop anywhere and half of the bikes for sale are electric. And the same on the streets, you're getting more and more electric bikes as we see. And I think, you know, every week that goes by, you see more electric vehicles in Sydney, and I'm sure the same in Melbourne. And so I think and you know, some of Byhad's graphs that he showed in his presentation just shows you we're on that cusp, and then it becomes a trend, then it becomes a behavioural, social, not an economic story, and people are putting on rooftop solar regardless of the economics now because they want to keep up the Joneses, you know. And I think that same thing will be the case with electric vehicles. We're about to jump through a few hurdles. I think the New South Wales government's electric vehicle programs will play a huge role in transforming the market. New South Wales is obviously the largest state in Australia, therefore it can play a similar role to California in the US in terms of market transition. And some of these programs we're designing and will roll out over the next couple of years will really change the vehicle market in Australia and get a lot more electric vehicles and more models into New South Wales and Australia, and then more vehicles being made available to the second-hand market.
Indeed. And look, I just have been passed a note to remind us that, in fact, at the Zero Emissions Byron Forum, EV Forum last year, there was actually an electric rickshaw on
there you go. Not from India.
That's right. So people coming to northern New South Wales into the Byron Shire who are keen for that electric rickshaw experience, well, you know, we're the people to turn to. Look,
I'm sure Sapoti Brooks on the line because he was involved with Zero Emissions Byron in the early days. And he's the man to talk to about bicycles and electric bicycles with rooftops and other things. So speak to Sapoti.
Okay, Sapoti, you're on notice. Look, this has been a terrific start to our webinar series. To go and to come right back, Byhad, to the wonderful graphs that you had up at the beginning of the discussion. When do you think we'll see electric vehicles come in around the $30,000 price?
That's a really good question. I think talking about that graph and the ability to rise rapidly, if it was about electric vehicles, you know, on its own and not about Australia in different markets, I would say this is the decade. So around the middle to the later part of this decade, we'll start to see that point occur where we're not talking about, you know, countries went from 4% to 5%. We're going to be talking about countries went from 9% to 90%, you know, within a couple of years. The key question within that becomes, you know, Australia, business as usual, without the type of things that Stephen's talking about, or without these type of policies, 5 to 7 years after everyone else, or in line with everyone else. That's entirely dependent on us.
Okay, look, at that point, I think that's a positive and appropriate place to bring this first discussion to a conclusion. I really want to thank Byhad Jafari and Stephen Bygrave for bringing both their expertise and their energy to tonight's discussion. It's been really great to have you two as our first panelists in this, the first of our 8 webinar series. Our next webinar, titled Making the Switch, will be held at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 1st of September. So 6 p.m. September 1st. Carola Jonas and Anthony Brusha Van Grono, they'll be talking about facets of electric vehicle adoption for homes and businesses. Once again, Zero Emissions Byron warmly thanks its sponsors, including our principal sponsor, Bank Australia, major sponsor, NRMA, and our community sponsors, ClubCar, Enova Community Energy, and Light Touch Solar and Electrical, for making this webinar series possible. We are deeply appreciative of the support we get so we can actually have these public conversations. If you came in late or you want to share this webinar to friends, keep an eye out on the Zero Emissions Byron website. That's zerobyron.org/webinars, where we will post a recording of tonight's discussion by the end of the week. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Once again, thanks to Byhad and to Stephen and for the technical support that we've received. I look forward to joining you next time when we have our next Zero Emissions Byron's webinar. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mick. Thanks, Byhad. Thanks, Zero Emissions Byron.